went from HR consulting to being a publishing entrepreneur and evangelist, but he's got better words for it than I do. So why don't I let you go ahead and explain who you are and what you're about and what you're doing and how you came to
Sure.
the book.
Well, thanks, Dean. By way of background, I've written 6 books, and this one I think ties into the other books in a number of different ways, but I've always been around data going back to my days working in human resources. Eventually got out of HR into consulting, helping companies implement ERP and CRM systems. So I've always been around data and data viz. The previous book, actually going back to the 4th book, The Age of the Platform, I discussed how companies like Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google do amazing things. In other words, they encourage innovation, they let people develop apps or books or services on top of their core products. As an offshoot of that, those companies generate a lot of information, and that became the 5th book, Too Big to Ignore, the business case for big data. After that book, I said to myself, there's so much more to say about big data. How do you actually make sense of it? And a blog post that I saw a couple weeks ago touched on the fact that data visualization was kind of the front end of big data. Now, this isn't the first book, as you well know, and your listeners know, about data visualization, but in my experience, many of the books going back to when I was 19 years old at Carnegie Mellon, reading Tufte's book, Visual Display of Quantitative Information, focused more on the theory or how one could visualize data, the best way to present data in a pie chart or bar chart or a heat map. To my knowledge, this is the first book that looks at what organizations are actually doing, particularly around what we now affectionately call big data. But it isn't just about data viz, it's about a mindset, it's about understanding that the old tools worked well with small data, but perhaps we need new, more interactive tools to handle what we call big data. So that's a very short description of how I got to this point.
Well, I'm really glad you spoke about the mindset, because I think that's one of the most important things I pulled out of the book. In my notes, I wrote about the book and about data viz. I just want to talk also about the physical object. Are we doing a good between two ferns thing here?
I don't think we're nearly being as funny as Zach Galifianakis.
Oh, well.
Nobody is.
But the point is, for me, that you produced a physical book. I know that there's an ebook version, correct? But
Yes.
within the physical book, it's actually in full color, full page illustrations, which is absolutely terrific.
I felt very
really
strongly
vital.
that this book needed to be of a certain size, a certain quality, obviously color versus black and white. I had seen other books that were kind of crammed in black and white about data visualization. I felt like they didn't do the data or the data viz justice. So it's not easy to write a book that sells a decent number of copies, and no one will be mistaking me for Malcolm Gladwell anytime soon, but I thought by doing the book in this way, we maximized the chance that it had the impact that I think it could.
Great. Just by the by, are there also, because within the book there is a lot of discussion about interactivity,
Yes.
are there references for people to go and look at interactive things that will be referenced back in the book, or is
Yes.
that something you want to do? Or
It's not comprehensive because the web, as you know, changes very quickly.
Gosh, of course.
But I did, over the course of my research for the book, come across a very significant number of useful and in many cases open source or low-cost tools. Certainly with software as a service in the cloud, it's a lot more affordable to deploy best-of-breed solutions. This is in 1998 when companies spent millions of dollars on an enterprise-wide BI initiative. But in my 6 books, this is my first appendix, and that appendix is devoted to tools like Many Eyes or D3 or Tableau, some of the tools out there that organizations are using to turn the mess of big data into something that actually makes sense, to find, as they say, the signal in the noise.
right, and there's open source stuff. You talk about open source, and there are freemium models where people can go and play for a trial period or have limited resources, and then if they want to go do the deep dive, they can at various levels. So there's a lot of useful things. But going back to something where we talked about the mindset, where you spoke about the mindset, and I said I wanted to refer to that. So my first question is, when you talk to the C-suite, what's their fear, and how can they get to be a visual organization? And I hate the term C-suite, but you know, I'm wearing
Right.
Brooks Brothers, so I got to say that word. So.
Well, Dean, I would say that many organizations are really conservative and very hidebound. If you're a 55-year-old CIO and your organization failed 10 years ago implementing a BI product or ERP or CRM, and that was well understood, what are your odds of spending millions of dollars on Hadoop or a best-of-breed data viz tool and turning that into insight? So As you know, many organizations don't want to be early adopters. Many are in sort of the middle majority or the laggards phase. For every Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Netflix, companies that do big data exceptionally well, I would argue that thousands more don't. I do think it's fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of risk. The fact that you can't, in my opinion, tie a specific ROI to this stuff.
Very good
If you're
point,
looking at ERP, you might say, well, we spend $200,000 doing it manually. If we spend $1 million and we only spend $100,000, then over 10 years it pays for itself. With big data and data viz, I just don't think that you can make that case. Who knows what you're going to find? Many organizations, I think, to answer your question, focus far too much on the costs of action and not nearly enough on the costs of inaction. They look at companies, for example, like Netflix, and they're intimidated. They don't understand, however, that 15 years ago, Netflix couldn't do 1/10 of what it can do today. This is not an IT project, and I think that's a very difficult thing for many people to get their arms around. IT in many organizations still controls the data, and many line people complain about that, but if you remove IT from the equation and then they have access to the data and they're not making decisions based on it, then you really can't blame IT. So I do think that it's more of a cultural or organizational issue than it is a technology issue. The tools are out there. The only question to me is, are organizations willing to embrace them? And that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book.
Yeah. I think one of the hidden conversations that you don't necessarily bring to light, but you talk around it and you use some of the terminology is this fascination with being agile, being lean. These are new buzzwords about approach to innovation and development, and I get this very strong undercurrent that you're advocating that. You talk about in the book. You talk about the ambiguity or the fact that you don't get it right the first time. That it's an iterative process,
Yes.
And I think that's what you're alluding to, is that it's not. We're going to pull up a spreadsheet and we have what looks like something firm and complete because it's a bunch of numbers stuck in these boxes. That there's, when you can take a data visualization and twist and turn it and keep asking what if over and over and over again. I think that ambiguity is what you're getting at.
Sure, and there's a reason the subtitle contains the phrase, the quest for better decisions. I believe, Dean, as you probably do as well, that we no longer live in this era of set it and forget it. For instance, about 7-8 years ago, I went to a company in New Jersey to do some consulting and build a simple ETL tool, extract the data from one part of the system, transform it, and load it into another part. And when I came back 6-7 years ago, I should say 3 or 4 years ago, to do an upgrade, they used the same tool. And I asked the woman, have you tweaked it? Does it still work? No, I haven't tweaked it because it still works. That's fine, I'm glad I did my job as a consultant, but in this era of big data, when new data sources are streaming at us faster than ever, can we truthfully say that we are capturing everything we need to capture when we're ignoring new data sources? When 3-4 years ago, companies started to get their arms around social data sources like Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, and all of a sudden Pinterest sprouted up. Many organizations said, oh gosh, there's another one. Well, in point of fact, yes, you may have to deal with Pinterest because its engagement numbers are very strong. The point is that we do have to be comfortable with ambiguity. As I like to say, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that uncomfortability, that lack of a set process, that knowledge that what worked before may not work now or may not work in the future makes quite a few people uncomfortable. And as a result, they cling to traditional tools like KPIs and standard reports. And don't get me wrong, just because of big data, a P&L doesn't lose its importance. If you work in payroll, a payroll register still matters. But my question is, do those tools explain the whole story, or even the most important part of the story? And as I researched the book, I found that many organizations were willing to throw data out there, to investigate new data sources, to deploy new tools and see where it would take them without necessarily knowing, like in the case of Netflix, where it would take them. But there was this core belief that data matters, and they would figure out a use for it. And if they didn't, oh well, they still learned something.
I think what you're alluding to is the hidden fear. There's real disruption in what leadership is when it comes down to it. Especially, the bigger the company, the more it feels like the disruption will be massive. Because
Sure.
the whole underpinning of the top-down structure and all of that is shifting. So.
Yes, I mean, the innovator's dilemma, I would argue, is alive and well. Why did Mark Zuckerberg just drop $19 billion for WhatsApp when Facebook is, by all accounts, a healthy company? I give credit to the companies that may pay ungodly amounts of money for companies that I don't think are necessarily worth it, but they're willing to experiment, they're willing to fail. I think that it's silly, regardless of whether you're in telecom or cable, to assume that the world today will remain the same in 5, 10, 15 years. There's someone in a garage right now looking to disrupt every company. Why is Google spending a lot of money on Android and Glass? Well, because they understand at the highest levels that people won't necessarily search over the computer and find words through Google keywords. That could change, and Google wants to be prepared for it. That's why they're spending a lot of money on Nest, over $3 billion. That's why they're developing driverless cars and other secret things in Project X. So to me, this is more of a management book than a technology one, and certainly more so than a pure data viz book like ones from Tufte and Stephen Few.
Sure. One of the things also that I hear is a subtext, and it ties to both, we'll say, the management, leadership, organizational side of things, but also the technology side of things, is this idea of it's now so big and so broad that it takes a collaborative effort.
Yes.
To create, I'll call it the product, but why don't you elaborate on that a little?
Absolutely. I think that roles are becoming very blurry. In fact, one of the sexiest new job titles out there is data scientist, which to me is sort of a hybrid of a designer and a statistician and a technologist and a business person and a bunch of other things. Even a data modeler thrown in. I do think that there's a real danger in having someone in IT design a tool for 6 months, a year, and then it's theoretically finished, and then it gets rolled out to the line, and they look at it and go, I don't understand how to use this. Well, that's not very agile. That's very sort of waterfall oriented. Yes. And as I wrote about in my first book, Why New Systems Fail, the vast majority of waterfall projects fail for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is that there isn't that interactivity, there isn't that testing, there isn't that feedback, and that is very much based on this agile notion, or to quote Eric Ries from the Lean Startup, right, is this notion of a minimal viable product.
The MVP, sure.
Right, I do think that those types of concepts are inherent in these visual organizations. Just as an example, when I was researching the book, I came across a guy by the name of Justin Macheka from Autodesk, who created something called the Organic Org Chart, or Org Chart, which is in the book. And he used tools like processing and Python, and it's a fantastic interactive tool. And when I talked to him about it, I said, talk to me about your development process. You did not just sit down and then 6 months later it was finished. It's absolutely not. I was dealing with line people, I was asking for their feedback, and it wasn't a linear process. Sometimes he would blow things up, so he'd take a step back to take 2 steps forward. Again, that sort of contravenes a lot of people's conception of work. You're supposed to work in a very regimented, step-like manner. Well, that to me is incongruous with this notion of data discovery.
You're leading perfectly to this, my last question in my notes here is, so how can a statistician or a data scientist, but I like the idea of, how can a statistician become a storyteller?
Sure.
Because that's also implied, and there are moments where you talk about pulling the stories out of the data visualization to make it a much larger thing than just a pretty image or a piece of art.
Right. I'd say, Dean, that first up, it's important to recognize your audience. It's great to have done the work, to know the statistics and the theory behind it, but recognize that most people are not proper statisticians. Most people will, quite frankly, be intimidated or lost or just tune out if they hear things like type 1 or type 2 error or normal distribution. Learn from someone like Nate Silver, who is absolutely a statistician, but he writes well. Learn from someone like Malcolm Gladwell. I would argue that Gladwell's science, like many people believe, is flawed. He sort of cherry picks his stories to support his theory. That doesn't mean that it's universally applicable. However, few people can argue that he weaves a good yarn. Mm-hmm. The man knows how to tell a good story. Now, it's great to have the detail behind it, but recognize that most people really are interested in the story and what it means for them and what they can do. And if they ask you why should you do something totally different, then it's great to have the numbers behind it in case they're curious. But I found early in my career that if I led with the numbers, that was sort of perilous. One of my favorite stories as a consultant occurred when I was at that same company in New Jersey, and I had to develop that tool that I mentioned before. This is a great way to bookend it. And I was with a very tech-phobic HR person, and I was with the DBA, the database administrator, so very different audiences. And I had to explain what my tool did. I realized that I could not have that conversation at the same time to those two people. I told the HR person, give me a few minutes, why don't you get a cup of coffee? And I sat down with the DBA and I walked through at a very technical level which table and when it would run and what it would populate and the kind of backup procedure. It's a very technical discussion. He walked out going, perfect, I got it. And the woman comes back from HR and says, can you tell me what the tool does?